So as you're learning to code, there's all these concepts thrown at you, and it can feel like quite a bit. You might be scribbling notes furiously, maybe making yourself some flashcards, trying to pound this stuff into your brain. But I'm here to show you that there's actually 5 great ways for you to remember what you learn while you learn how to code. The first thing that you want to do is to establish a habit of coding every day. If you can do that, then some things like the syntax things that are going to seem very confusing at first, like your JavaScript syntax or HTML syntax, just basic syntax stuff. For example, like the first time you see an object in JavaScript, you might think, okay, it needs these curly braces, it needs a colon, it needs some other curly braces. How do I remember that? That'll just be second nature to you once you start programming frequently because you use objects so much. The same can be said for HTML. You might think, oh, I have to memorize what a div stands for or body and head. No, that stuff's just going to become second nature because you're going to use it so much. So the good way to establish a habit of coding every day is to do something called habit stacking. Every day you probably have some habits. You probably go to bed at the same time, roughly. Probably wake up around the same time, roughly, every day. Maybe you eat lunch. Whatever it is, one thing in your day, try and do that regularly, and then stack other habits around it. So before lunch, you might do a coding session, or after lunch, you might do a coding session, or you might do coding right as soon as you wake up. For me, I like to, wake up, take a shower, then I help my baby boy get some food, and then I start coding. I stacked it right into my morning routine, and then boom, right into the next thing. And that's the best way to start new habits is to stack on top of previously existing habits. So the stuff that you use often and use every day, if you have a habit of stacking and doing these habits every day, you're not going to have to memorize that syntax stuff, so you don't have to be afraid of it. Just first focus on the habit of coding every day. Second, I want to show you some stuff on my screen. I'm going to talk about the second method, which is knowing what's possible and how to find it. So I'm going to switch over to my screen real quick. If you know what's possible in CSS, you can just know where to find it. You can Google CSS cheat sheet and you say, I know that CSS is good for manipulating fonts. That's true. And here's all the ways that you can do that. So you can just Google that and look it up. I know that CSS is, it might have some borders, right? And there's another property called outlines. So you could go all the way down here and find outlines. I thought I saw it. Here it is. So there's ways of handling hyperlinks. If you know what CSS is capable of, with its layout, style, text, padding, that sort of stuff, borders, background images. If you know what CSS is capable of, then you can just go to a cheat sheet and find the way to do that. I haven't memorized all the stuff that I can do with text. I know that it's possible to transform everything, every piece of text into uppercase, for example. I know that it's possible, but I don't remember quite the right way to do that. Is it transform text? Is it text transform? Is it uppercase? Is it capitalized? What's going on? So I look and I see, it has here's the property right here, text transform, and there's uppercase right there. I can try capitalize, which is going to capitalize the first word of everything, but uppercase is what I want for this particular example. So knowing what's possible and then just Googling a cheat sheet. The same can be said for jQuery. I haven't memorized all of the jQuery tree traversal stuff. I'm always going up and down the tree in the DOM with jQuery to figure stuff out, but I can't really tell you next all, next until, next. I don't really remember, and so sometimes what I do is I just look at the cheat sheet and I say next until, and then I can click on that and just look at the documentation right here and then get exactly what I need. So you don't have to memorize that stuff. You just have to know what's possible with whatever you're working on and where to find it. We can do the same thing with Bootstrap. Once you start using Bootstrap frequently, you can say, okay, I know what's possible. Here's where I can find it. If I wanted to center columns, I can just say center columns, form grid, form row, Okay, this is for forms. That's not what I want. Another way is to just do this. Center. I don't want to center columns. So center a div bootstrap 4. That's really what I always want to do. And you can see that it takes me to the bootstrap documentation for Flex. So I go there, and this is where I can look down here and see. Okay, I use justify content with the once it's given a display of Flex, justify content center. That's to say, I know that it's possible to do this in Bootstrap, and I know where to find it. I can Google it. I can look in the documentation and find what I need. So same thing we said for JavaScript methods. You don't have to memorize every method. It's probably useful if you do, but each one has its own parameters and its own return values. For example, this one always gets me. I use push somewhat frequently. Not as frequently as something like map or filter. I use those far more frequently, but I do use push. I can never remember what it returns because it's so confusing to me. I would think that it would return some new array, but actually what it does every time is it returns a number, which is the length property of the object upon which the method was called. So that's kind of a gotcha in JavaScript. It's not something I would expect. But that's what it is, and so I know that. So what I do is I just Google, JavaScript MDN. JavaScript push array MDN, and I do MDN because I know that's the resource I want to look at. So once you start knowing, these resources, like the Bootstrap documentation, the jQuery cheat sheet, that's all you have to know. You don't have to memorize all what the parameters it is and what the return values are. You just know how to get that answer quickly. So that could come as a relief to some folks that wanted to memorize all these things. And I'm going to tell you right now that it might be a dead end to try to memorize everything because languages and documentation gets updated frequently. I think a stronger skill for developers is to know what's possible and how to find it. On that note, I want to talk about creating your own reference. Like I said, references do go out of style, but sometimes you find yourself doing something so infrequently and you find yourself looking it up and following these steps, and it can be kind of a pain in the butt. Git and GitHub integration is one of those things. Some folks remember all of their Git commands and everything like that. I honestly don't think it's that valuable to know how to create your own, to recreate, like here what I'm doing here, I'm creating a React app and adding it to a GitHub repository. How often do you start a new app and then add it to your repo? If you're pretty prolific, maybe once a month. So that once a month activity might not be something that sticks in your memory. For other developers, it's something like once every couple months that you have to do this. That's fine. Just make your own documentation. So this is documentation on how to start totally from scratch, and it actually changed in the past year. This documentation is using NPX. Just in the past year, we were using NPM Create React App. So NPX is now what we're using. So you just write this documentation and update it as needed, but really it's your own reference because sometimes Googling this thing can provide you less easily, readable steps. For example, I've made this custom Mongo dump from production database and Mongo restore to local database. This was something I did a while ago in 2016, and I just wanted this command, very personal to myself. It's not something I could Google. So what I did is I just wrote my own reference here. Of course, I don't expose the password. I do expose the admin name, which I shouldn't have done. I should have just put that inside of this LastPass repository as well. I do the same kind of thing nowadays, but instead of storing something in LastPass, I store it in my .env file. I store passwords and stuff in the .env file, and then I store that in LastPass if I ever needed to share it with anyone. So again, this is a very personal collection, but it's a way to create my own reference so that I can go back to this stuff later and I don't have to memorize this long command, and I don't have to memorize every one of these parameters. Because honestly, if it's something you're doing once a month or once every couple months, it's wasting your time to try and commit this stuff to memory when you could just make your own documentation and reference it as needed. This is we talked a little bit about Googling something, but this is the fourth way I recommend. And instead of, and I don't want to say just Google it, but I want to say know what you're asking and how to ask. So Google Foo is a skill in programming. So here it's very explicit that I'm saying center a div bootstrap for, and it gets me to the right content, either the bootstrap official documentation or this. I can see actually that this isn't what I want. So what I would want to do is be more explicit in how I ask. I would say horizontally center a div. Great. And now I get the exact answer I want. So you have to know exactly what you're asking for. If I wanted to make a difference between horizontal centering and vertical centering, you have to be explicit in your Google search. You have to, just like you have to be explicit with what version of Bootstrap you're searching for, and then what element you're trying to center. So horizontally center a div Bootstrap for, and I get some great results here, as well as the official documentation. So know what you're asking and how to ask it. So that's what I have. Oh, I'll show you one more thing for Google. This is a good example all the time because I use this next one all the time, and what I want to say is that I'll never memorize this next command. So let's say I want to validate email address. I know I'm probably going to use regex. Again, you have to know how to ask, know what you're asking for specifically, and then how to phrase it so that Google can serve up the right answer. So I want to validate an email address with regex for JavaScript. And that's the first answer I get, how to validate an email in JavaScript. And it says using regular expressions. Okay, I said regex up here. But you can see that this is a very popular question with a very popular answer. And it's this regex right here, this long piece of code. And am I going to memorize this? No. And so that's the real point, is that I'll never memorize this. This will also change over time. There's simple versions of it and whatever. And this is like a living, breathing document. So you'll probably want to Google this instead of. You could store this as a reference, but if something like this, I know Stack Overflow snippets do change over time, so I would just Google it and know. Again, the important thing is know how to phrase your question in Google, and explicitly what you want. So that's 4 ways, and we haven't really even said how to memorize things, and that's kind of on purpose because majority of what programmers do is they don't memorize things. They simply memorize where things are and how to find them. I'm going to switch back real quick. Let's find OBS. Hi, I'm back. So I want to talk about finally memorizing stuff. You will have to memorize some stuff while learning how to code. It'll be too valuable to not. It's valuable. It's needed. You will have to memorize some things. It stinks. So I have a memory technique that I use. These are learned from. I have lots of books on memory. Harry Lorraine, Jerry Lucas, Dominic O'Brien. They've all written exceptional books on memory, and I want to just use an example right here. I'm going to read this. This is my flashcard. So here's what I do. I write a flashcard, the front, back. I'm going to read it off because you won't be able to see on the camera. So here you go. Front of the flashcard. Jim Thorpe, an old-time footballer, has 8 octopus arms, and he's using them to cook hash browns. All right, I'm just going to stop the video right there. At this point, you're like, what are you talking about? And I think that's fair. We are using memorable imagery to trigger our brains to recall things that are associated with other things. Here's what I actually memorized. When I think of Jim Thorpe, who was just an old-time football player, 1920, 1910 era, he's got 8 octopus arms, and he's cooking hash browns. That tells me that the technical term for hashtag is octothorpe. So what you do when you come across a piece of trivia that you have to stick in your brain, and I'm going to give you 2 better examples. This is just a kind of a silly example just to show you that I'll never forget what the technical term for a hashtag is. When I see a fact like this, the technical term for a hashtag or pound symbol is octothorpe. How will I remember octothorpe? Well, I break it up into several parts, and obviously the word octo for me, the most memorable thing is an octopus and octopus arms. The second most memorable thing, I look at the word Thorpe, and you could break that. You could use something like Thor, from the Marvel comics, or Thor from the, I don't know, is that Norse mythology? You could use Thorpe like I did because Jim Thorpe was a memorable thing that I learned in grade school. So Jim Thorpe is an old footballer, and he's got 8 octopus arms, and I associate it to hash tags by saying he's cooking hash browns. So just this random word association, and you always want to pick something that's most memorable to you. And that's what goes on the front of your flashcard. This weird Jim Thorpe, the old-time footballer, has 8 octopus arms, and he's using them to cook hash browns. And when I read that to myself, that's the front of the flashcard. It should trigger the answer, which is the back of the flashcard. The technical term for a hashtag or pound symbol is an octothorpe. So that's how I do it. Come up with your own memorable images for concepts that you come across. I'm going to give you 2 examples. These are real-life examples. This is a real flashcard that I have, and I just use these simple 3x5 small, cheap index cards, flashcards. You can buy these very cheap. I needed to memorize the fact that map in JavaScript, the map function, is asynchronous. So the map method is asynchronous. So the reason that I had to memorize this is because it came up as a bug so often in the way I would write code. I don't do a lot of for loops. I do a lot of mapping to new objects or mapping to new arrays. So map is what I use. And the problem is if you were waiting on something, if you called a function and you were waiting on it, you needed it to wait on a piece of thing, like you're inserting into a database, and you need them to all happen at the same time. For some reason, you're using map to do that. Map doesn't go one at a time through everything in the array that it's mapping. It actually goes asynchronously, and it tries to do them all at once. And so this will cause you some trouble if you have stuff that's dependent on other stuff being inserted when you do that. So it was a hard bug for me to Google and find. I just needed to memorize the fact that map is asynchronous. So how do I do that? Well, I think of the word map. And the most memorable image for me with map, if I really think about it, and you'll have to come up with your own, remember, but if I really think about it, I think of struggling to open the glove box in my first car, which is a blue Dodge Dakota truck. That's the first vehicle I owned as a teenager. I was at the time before GPS, before smartphones, GPS, any of that stuff. So we had maps in the glove box. That was a thing. And I remember driving around struggling to find this map in the glove box while driving, and it was just a pain in the butt experience. But that's what I think of when I think of map. I think of this old map that I can pull out of the glove box, this big fold-out thing, and that's very memorable to me, that experience. Pick your own thing. So now how do I match that with the fact that it's asynchronous? That seems like a weird thing to try and remember. What do I associate with the word asynchronous? Well, asynchronous, like I said, just means everything happening at once, not instead of in order. So imagine that if I open this glove box to pull the map out, instead, what if like hundreds of maps came flying out at me all at once. I just have all these maps everywhere. And that's another trick when you're making your visual images, is to make them slightly ridiculous. So instead of like 3 maps coming out at me asynchronously, no, I have to think hundreds of maps coming out at me asynchronously. So that's the real trick, is make a memorable image that's ridiculous, that's something that's personal to you, but then slightly exaggerated in this ridiculous way that you're going to make it memorable. So when I look at the front of this card, remember the back of the card is the fact that I wanted to remember map is asynchronous. So when I review this, I write on the front the mental image I just shared with you. So I review my flashcards. In this first flashcard, it said Jim Thorpe, the old-time footballer, has 8 octopus arms, and he's using them to cook hash browns. I know that hashtag, the technical term for that is Octothorpe, from that flashcard. Then I come to my next flashcard and I read it and I say, I reach in the glove box of my blue Dodge Dakota to pull out a map. Instead, dozens come flying out at me all at once. So dozens, hundreds, lots of maps come flying out at me all at once, and I know that map is asynchronous. That's what that tells me. The other thing I do is I do write the domain in the upper corner of the flashcard. I'll write like, this is for JavaScript, this is for learning Spanish, whatever it is. Don't get too specific with your domains. You don't want something like Spanish verbs or Spanish nouns. You really just want Spanish because you want to mix all these things. So if you're learning Spanish, if you're learning programming, whatever it is, they should all be in one master flashcard deck. That's because that's how our brains learn best, by mixing these things up and then trying to reach and recall in weird spots. If we put ourselves in the mode of just studying programming or just studying a language or whatever it is that we're memorizing with flashcards, and we only do one thing at a certain time, it actually it makes it too easy on our brain, and the effects are less powerful. So mix up your flashcards. That's a good tip. Finally, I have another one I need to memorize. If you starting programming and you're working with Bootstrap, you need to know that Bootstrap 4, you must follow the container row column pattern. You'll get some weird bugs, some weird layout issues if you don't follow container row column. So let me read you the mental image that I created. And again, create your own for all of these, but this is just to show you a technique. When you do something like container row column, that has to be in a specific order. You can do a mental technique called linking. You can link the things, link these fantastical images. I didn't really do it with the other two. I didn't really need to. But here the order matters, container row column, that matters for what you're learning. So what I do is I create a mental image for the first one, and I link it to the second one. So the first one is container. The most memorable mental image for me personally is my son playing with plastic Tupperware containers. So when I see that mental image, I think of container. So if I see my son playing with a Tupperware container, I think container in my mind. The next thing you need to memorize is row. So row is such a bland, boring word. You might think of cornrows and hair. You might think of rows of, I don't know. I personally think of rows of corn because I grew up on a farm and we had a cornfield right next to us. And I would get lost in the rows of corn, and they were very memorable. I can feel the corn as I walk past it. And that's another good thing for your memory, is to involve as many senses as you can in these images. So when I think about the corn, and it was actually rough and sticky, these leaves. So I think about that. They would cut a little bit as you walked by them, but you could still run around and play in the cornfields. Next thing we have to memorize is column. So I want to go back a second and I want to say, okay, how can I link containers and rows first? How can I link these two things? One thing you'll do is you'll just make this fantastic mental images that makes these things related in some way. And I like to make them related in the order and you'll see what I mean. So you have these Tupperware containers that I imagine for containers. My son is playing with these containers. He's on the floor, and they're scooting around on the floor. Inside of the container, growing out of them, is rows of corn. And that's how I go one into the next. So, okay, so that's kind of this weird, fantastical image, but that sticks in my mind. So my son is on the floor, and he's playing with these containers, but they have these rows of corn growing out of them. And then the next thing I have to memorize is column. And the most memorable thing for me personally, again, it has to be personal, every one of these things, is the newspaper column that I had in high school. I wrote a column reviewing movies and music. I was very opinionated and not a great writer, but I had fun doing it and had my mug on the newspaper. So that's a memorable thing for me for the word column. So how do I attach it to the previous thing? I don't have to attach it to container. I just have to attach it to the previous thing, which is row. So these rows of corn, instead of growing corn, they're growing out rolled up newspapers, and I can see my newspaper column coming out of these rows. So I have a container on the floor, is growing out rows of corn. Out of the corn is growing these newspaper columns. And so I wrote that all down. That's the front of my flashcard here. My son is playing with Tupperware containers. Growing out of the containers are rows of corn. Instead of corn, my newspaper column is growing out of each stalk. Now, when I look at that and I think about that fantastical image, what do I know? What do I think about? I think container, row, column. Just comes to me naturally. It's a lot easier than trying to pound it into your head and memorize container, row, column, container, row, column. That's a silly way to memorize things because our brains are built to handle mental images a lot easier. And that's a good way to memorize things with like these trivia things that are going to come up and catch you in programming. So 80% of the time, you're not going to be memorized. You're not going to have to use these advanced techniques. You'll know how to look for something on Google. You'll know where the documentations are. You know what's possible in the language you're working on. You're also coding every day, so the basic stuff you're just going to have down pat. You're going to create your own reference documents, remember. So finally, if all that fails and you need to memorize certain facts, you'll do this flashcard trick. You'll create these mental images and first write down the fact on the back of the flashcard. But the front of the flashcard, the thing that you need to practice is this mental image. Because if I just try practicing, map is asynchronous. If I made like a flashcard that was like fill in the blank, map is blank. Like I'm never going to recall what I'm talking about here. So maybe I know, if you're like me, you've made very technical flashcards in the past, here is how I would solve this problem and blah, 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 and this big block of code. Well, that doesn't help anyone. Code, just like anything, can be expressed with powerful mental images that can stick and help your memory. So that's the final trick, is to do that when it comes to those things where the other four methods aren't really, they're not going to do the trick. So you can finally do this flashcard tricks and create memorable flashcards. And that's how to remember what you learn while you learn to code.